Welcome back to my tutorials. I've had a couple of issues here with the sound just because the Santa Ana winds have started blowing pretty heavily. We woke up last night, there was like 50-60 mile an hour gusts, so I do apologize in advance if the sound quality isn't very good. But anyway, moving on to my tutorial. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about this particular painting. It's of a beachscape in a place called La Piedra. La Piedra means the rocks, I believe. And this is my first landscape commission painting that I'm doing. I'm doing one of three. So the customer contacted me after I did my last Topanga beach scene and asked me if I'd be interested in doing a couple of commissions or 3 commissions as a gift from the customer to her husband. So a little bit of background information: the husband was a surfer and was raised here on the coast. So there were 2 or 3 particular locations that the client wanted me to paint, and the first one was a very personal piece to the couple. So La Piedra was the first painting I've been commissioned to make. Now my choice of angle and composition was something that I went back and forth quite a bit with the customer. They wanted something that really echoed the sense of place but also incorporated the rocks. So I went down to the beach, I took a number of photographs, I selected a handful of pictures I thought would make strong paintings, sent them off to the customer, and they came back with this particular composition. I edited some of the colours a little bit and changed the sky so that I had more diagonal lines in the painting, which really strengthened the composition, and we agreed on this particular view. So the painting you're about to see, this tutorial that I did, was, as I said, a collaboration between myself and the customer. I like to do these commission paintings because I get some guidance on what they want, and it also challenges me to be more focused, to listen to the customer, to work my images and compositions so that I really find a nice balance between what I want to do and what they want to purchase. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump straight into this tutorial. A lot of the information I can share with you as we go along. But before I do, I just wanted to ask you for your feedback, please. You can comment during this tutorial. It's going to give me a better idea of what you would want to see, what maybe I'm just scanning over and you'd like me to go into further depth. So if there's something about the composition, the mediums that I'm using, the way that I've set up this tutorial, if you'd like to see the palette while I'm working, or you want me to elaborate on anything that you think I may be just skimming over, please go ahead and comment in the box, and then I'll go through those comments and make sure to apply those to the following tutorials. Finally, thank you so much for subscribing to my channel. I can't thank you enough. It gives me loads of inspiration to film these tutorials in my studio, film my painting process, and it also really helps me think about why I do what I do and share that with you. I'm very grateful for whatever tier subscription you've chosen. It helps me with my painting, it helps me here in the studio, it helps my family, and it really gives me confidence to continue what I'm doing. So thank you so much for your subscription. So let's get started. So this is a 16-inch by 12-inch canvas board which I made myself. I bought this wonderful double oil primed canvas in a roll from Japan, and I've cut it into sections and adhered it to a hardboard that doesn't warp. I love the feel of the surface, so this is my new, pretty much until I use up all of the canvas, my new medium surface that I'm going to be working on. As usual, I've gone and covered the ground with a warm tone, and the reason for this is the reference photographs that I took were during the fires in California, so the light down at the ocean had this really warm red tone to it. So I decided to go deeper than I would normally go with my toned ground. And since this is a voiceover and it's not me painting in high speed live, I will admit at this point that this was a bit of a mistake. Reason for this? Well, I went too red, and the medium I used dried much slower than what I would normally use. Now, when I ground and tone my canvases generally, I use a very tiny piece of oil paint mixed with a thinner, like a white spirit or a odorless mineral spirit. I use Gamsol for the most part when I'm using odorless mineral spirit. And what happens is that evaporates and the ground dries very quickly, especially when I wipe it back. On this particular occasion, and I don't know why, I went very heavy with my ground, and I used a lean medium from CCS, Chelsea Classical Studio medium, which I do love, but probably not the best thing for my ground, and it didn't dry as quickly as I wanted it to. And the problem with that was when I started painting my colours in, too much of my ground medium bled into my colours, so it took a lot longer for me to actually build up those opaque colours, and actually didn't have a lot of control. So I don't want to go into too much depth of where I went wrong, but on this particular occasion that ground is too heavy. I mean, I learn every painting. Hopefully I'll continue to learn something new from every painting I make. This particular occasion the medium was wrong, and I should have stuck to what I knew, and it was too heavy an application. I did try and wipe some of it away, but it was very hard for me to get really clean blues and very clean whites until that had completely dried. So instead of making this a 2-day session, it ended up being maybe 3 days of painting with probably a couple of days in between. But let's not focus on that too much. Let's look at what I actually did right with this painting. As usual, if you've seen any of the tutorials in the past, I'm just lining in the composition using a small rosemary brush with a little bit of burnt umber, and I'm wiping away some of that excess toned ground to reveal some of the lighter tones, especially through the sky. I'm starting to feel immediately that I put it on too heavy, so I'm just using a rag to wipe away some of that sky. Generally, if this was just some mineral spirits, I'd have to be a little quicker about getting the white of the canvas back, wiping back to the white of the canvas, just because, as I mentioned, if it's put on thinly enough, it will stain and dry pretty quickly. I'd have to use more mineral spirits to wipe it away. This is a bit of a new technique. I've seen other artists do this, just putting in a highlight so that I can be a little bit clearer with my tones. This is going to be my highest value, and just having that on there from the beginning, I can get a better gauge of how dark to make my darks. So just put in a lick of light on there. I've got something to always just a reference back in the image and be like, okay, well, this is as high as I'm going to go. It's hard sometimes when the whole canvas is just covered in one ground and you're not seeing your maximum tonal value, especially when you're setting down your darks. My reference image, I used a program to break that down into a black and white monotone image, and separated the values to about 4 or 5 so that I could just get my value structure correct to start with. I mean, when I'm in the studio, I've got the luxury of time and consistency, so I'm going to use as many of the tools as possible that I have to hand to make sure I get my foundation correct. And I wanted to make this into a grayscale, a grisaille to paint over. So I'm using those 4 different shades of grey plus white as my 5 tones. So my goal at the beginning, knowing that I was going to make a grisaille underpainting, was to have some of that warm underpainting leak into my greys and kind of consolidate the painting, make it harmonious even in that underpainting stage. But as I mentioned a little earlier, because I used a different medium, it was very hard for me just to get those grey tones opaque enough. As you can see, I'm having to layer those greys on quite thick, and that ground is really influencing the grey tone. And I didn't want my underpainting to be thick. The underpainting is supposed to be the thinnest, most lean layer. But as soon as I was putting any of it on, it was just either turning immediately orange or just wiping off. So it was a little bit of a challenge, and I had to go thicker than I would normally like to go, just applying the grey tones. So for clarity, I'm using 5 tones, 5 grey tones that I pre-mixed from primary colours. They were mixed from a medium cadmium yellow, medium cadmium red, and an ultramarine blue. I pre-mixed them, I take them out into the field with me, I put them into tubes, and I felt like they were really good. They were really good spaces between those different values. If we call white my value number 1, then a light grey would be 2, medium grey would be 3, a darker grey would be 4, and number 5 value tone would be close to black. Not quite black, but a very dark grey. Neutral greys, as much as I could get them neutral greys. Took a few hours for me to mix those greys a while back, but I felt good that they were like a warm neutral tone. If you haven't seen my previous tutorials, I talk about what I learned from Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting by John Carlson. You can get that book on Amazon. But he broke down some really fascinating methods to create a value study. In his book, if you've got the book or if you wanted to buy the book, it's chapter 3 and it's called Angles and Consequent Values. And what's fascinating about it's a principle, but it's not 100% across the board. It'll get you close to where you need to be when you're making a value study. And he talks about planes of the landscape. And there's 4 prime planes in the landscape. In his book, he talks about plane number 1 being the flat-lying plane, i.e. the ground. Plane number 2 is the upright plane of the trees, so any verticals. Value number 3, or plane number 3, is the slanting plane of mountains. And he's got a wonderful diagram in the book, which I might be able to add to this. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll show you a quick diagram here. In his book, number 4 is the lightest value, number 1 being the second, number 3 being the third, and number 2 being the fourth. Now, there's obviously exceptions to this, and it isn't a rule, but it gives you a good basis for creating your value study. And it's just a sound guide to get you started and make sure that you are adhering to somewhat the laws of nature. So your light source is always going to be pretty much the brightest area, light source generally being the sky. Quite often cloudy skies are even brighter because the whiteness of the cloud, sometimes if it's a clear sky, the blue of the sky, if you're not looking directly at the sun, which you should never do really, the blueness of the sky is going to be somewhat darker than a backlit cloud. So just in principle, your sky is going to be lighter than your ground if you look at the scene as a whole. And then the angle of the plane that's going to be facing that, generally the flat plane of the ground, is going to be your second lightest plane because it's perpendicular to the light source and reflecting it back. Anything with an angle then is going to be your third lightest. If it's slightly angled up towards the sky but also slightly angled towards the viewer, that's going to be third in value. And then the darkest values are going to tend to be the objects that are vertical because they're not really reflecting much light back to the viewer. So that's how I understand the principle, and I've used that recently with some success. Again, I say there are exceptions to this, and it's not a set in stone rule. For instance, if you're painting water and that break in the water, or if you're painting sand, or if you're painting snow, then that's going to turn the rule on its head a little bit because the snow is going to reflect a lot of light, as is the white water and also sand. So, but generally sand, your sand could be lighter than your sky if your sky is a darker blue and the sand is very white. Same principle goes with snow, but for the most part, if you think about those elements as light source, flat plane, angular plane, and then vertical planes, you're going to be in the ballpark. And that's what I've used quite often to kind of guide me. On this occasion, it holds fairly true. My light source, my sky is going to be quite bright in those values I was mentioning earlier. I'll just go 1 through 5 from light to dark. My sky is going to be mostly, 1 or 2. Probably 2 in its grey value, just because there's clouds. But I did struggle to get my values right because that ground medium was too wet and it was just influencing those greys a little bit more than I would like. And I was having to put on my grey values more opaquely, and therefore the drying time was affected. One nice thing that came of this is that you do see a lot of that ground, a lot of that orange colour is influencing those values, and that stays right through to the end of the painting and consolidates, gives a nice harmonious feel to the painting as a whole. I was happy with my blocking in of those values, and I'm just fine-tuning those areas, trying to keep it nice and expressive, keep those marks, be nice and fluid. I'm working on some of my lines here, making sure that my planes feel natural and consistent. Sky is bright, the white water is brighter, my sand is value 2, my ocean then is value 3, and then those verticals in the landscape on the right hand side in those mountains is my darkest value in relation to the whole. So one other thing that I've done more of as I've been learning to paint outdoors is, instead of staring into the objects to analyze their value, I've tried to see them in relation to what they are next to. So for instance, if I'm painting that mountain over on the right hand side, I'm generally looking back to the sky and then judging the value of the mountain in my peripheral vision in relation to the sky. So easy to get lost in the values if all you're staring at is that hillside on the right hand side. You'll see so many value variations and a much wider gamut of values if you're just looking at the localized area. So you always have to make sure you're in relation to the other elements in the painting as a whole. How do those hills feel compared to the sky, compared to in relation to the ground? Just keep measuring them back and forth to the other elements in the painting. So I was hoping on day one to get my underpainting in and then to block in some of my colours. And I quite liked just pasting on some of those blues, which I pre-mixed. But I was having to be very heavy-handed with the opacity of my block-in colours because of the slow drying time or slower drying time of my ground and how heavy I was with my greys. So the problem I was finding immediately, even though I like the orange coming through in patches, and it reminds me, I really like Edgar Payne's work. I love the way that his ground comes through, especially in his sky, and it causes that vibrant movement of the sky when you've got those complementary colours working together. But the problem I felt I was having was the greys were making my blues really muddy and really over desaturating. Can I say that? Does that make sense? They were like taking away from the saturation of the sky, and I really wanted that sky to be nice and blue. It was making it far too muddy and grey. And you can see in those areas where I was putting the blue on lightly, you just see too much of that brownish orange coming back through. So I knew that I wasn't going to get very far on this first day, so my goal was simply just to lay on some of those major colour masses of the forms, block in those colours as a guide, and I knew that I would probably have to wait a couple of days for it to be dry enough to work into. You can already see that I'm going quite thick with the highlights there, much thicker than I would normally go. So I do love seeing those little bits of orange come through, though. Something that I'm going to allow to happen more as I work on my paintings. Again, if I'm being completely honest, I think I overwork the sky at this point when I'm laying in my ground. I should just really be blocking them in, and right about now moving on to a different area of the painting. And as if by magic, I hear myself. So we're working on those colours now, trying to keep the tones consistent with whatever's already down there. I mean, the fact that my greys are still wet while I'm working in these tones, they are going to help me to keep my tonal value the same. I am being quite heavy-handed with my colours. That's okay, because I'm also having to counter the fact that those greys are too thick and too wet right now. Quite like this stage of just blocking in the colours. I'd mixed the colours on my palette, or I'd mixed the block-in colours so that I knew that I had enough pre-mixed colour so that I wasn't constantly having to remix and remix like a DJ. I think there was greens on my palette, obviously the blue of the sky, the blue of the water, and then the sand tones, which are a lot of ochre, burnt umber mixed with white, and believe it or not, loads of purple. I always find it exciting to add purple to the wet sand, because it's got, you know, obviously the nature of the wet sand. It has brown, but it's reflecting the sky, so you bring blue to that, and then you've got a reddish, brownish blue, making a nice purple in the reflection. I think this is where I struggled most. Keeping the areas light, keeping them blue, wanting the whites and the blues to be cleaner, but I wasn't able to maintain that, so I somewhat bailed on doing the white water. I knew when I was putting the colours on that I was just making it muddy, and I was making it green, and there wasn't a lot of green. I wasn't seeing a lot of green in that water, but the orange was really influencing the warmth, and the yellow of the orange was really influencing my blue tones and turning them much too green. So there's that purple in the sand there. It looks a little bit blue, but it's definitely purplish. I started using a flat rosemary ivory brush because it holds the paint a bit better and almost pastes it on like a palette knife. But I changed my mind, and I had more success, I think, by working my angles and actually pasting the paint on with a filbert, a more bristly filbert. So that's what I'm using here. Keeping it consistent with the underpainting and the marks of the underpainting. A lot of those rocks and areas on the right hand side, there's a lot of greys in there. Now and again there's bits of orange and white and more tones, but I didn't want to tackle those tones so early into the painting. I just wanted to block in those colours and give the impression that it was rocky over there on the right hand side. One of the things that I did with my image when I was editing it was to be very cautious about the greens. What's lovely about beach scenes is they are naturally harmonious for the most part because of the complementary colours. You have the blues and then the warm kind of yellow ochres leaning towards oranges. So a beach scene tends to be, if you're painting ocean and sand, tends to be naturally complementary. So when you start adding greens to the painting, it can mess up your complementary color palette sometimes. So I was very cautious and I wanted to make sure that those greens weren't overly potent and saturated, and they leaned more towards warm brown greens than very harsh, bright colours. Since that light was very hazy and smoky, the highlights are also tinted quite a bit with that warm orange, especially on the foliage on the right hand side. So I'm getting close to blocking in all of those colours on the first pass. A lot of this painting is actually comes to life in the second half when I start adding those details. I'm being cautious not to overwork those tones, like I explained earlier on. I've got to keep that mountain the same sort of value in relation to the sky as when I did my value piece, my underpainting. If you've subscribed to my $5 subscription, that covers the conception of the painting, the line work, the composition, the underpainting and the blocking in. So all of the features that you've seen so far. And if you're a $10 subscriber to my advanced level, you will have access to part 2 of this tutorial, which goes into details, correcting those colors, working on some of the fine tuning of my tones, my values, helping the painting lean towards cool and warm areas, modifying some of the colors by adding small dots of complementary colors. It basically goes into details, making those final touches that bring the painting to life. So thank you so much, my $5 subscribers. Thank you so much. If you want to upgrade your account at any point to that $10 subscription, you can do so. If you need to downgrade your account and you just want to get more details about the blocking in and the color mixing, feel free to do that as well. Like I said in my introduction, I really appreciate all of your feedback. Anything that you want to see more of or you want me to talk about in more depth, I'm happy to do that, but I'd like to hear from you. So for now, I'm gonna start to wrap up my part 1 and then jump into my advanced level subscription part 2 as I start to work in more of the details. Thank you for all of your support.